Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Daniel Green. I'm the president of the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for this evening's Conversations at the Newberry program, Who Belongs? A conversation about the long history of American identity with Professors Erika and Kathleen Belew. Tonight's program is being live streamed on Zoom, so I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us virtually. The Conversations at the Newberry series is now in its 11th year, and it's generously sponsored by Sue and Melvin Gray. Thank you very much to Sue and Melvin Gray. The Newberry Library supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Since our founding in 1887, we've been free and open to the public, and dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us through conversations like this one. Today's program is one example of the Newberry Library's civic commitment to public education and intellectual engagement, bringing together communities of scholars, students, and the public to discuss ideas that matter in our world today is central to the Newberry's mission. Please visit our website, newberry.org, to learn more about our collections and exhibitions, digital resources, online classes, and free virtual and in-person public programs like this one. If you'd like to help us keep our reading rooms, exhibitions, and public programs free and open to all, you'll also find a link there to make a donation. At the conclusion of the conversation, we invite you to text your questions to this number, 833-899-3399. Whether you're here in person or whether you're joining us on Zoom, please text the question to that number, and we'll have time at the end of the program for the speakers to answer questions. So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Kathleen Belew is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Chicago. Her first book, Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America, explores how white power activists formed a cohesive social movement through a common story about warfare and its weapons, uniforms, and technologies. Bring the War Home helps us understand that current concerns about resurgent white supremacy should be understood as part of a long history. Belew is also co-editor of and contributor to a field guide to white supremacy, and she's contributed essays to Myth America and the Presidency of Donald J. Trump, a first historical assessment. Her next book, Home at the End of the World, will illuminate our era of apocalypse through a history focused on her own native Colorado, where in the 1990s, high-profile kidnappings and murders, right-wing religious ideology, and a mass shooting exposed divisions in American social fabric and dramatically changed our relationship with place, violence, and politics. Belew is in high demand in the media today, helping us all understand the context of white supremacist violence. You may have heard her on The Rachel Maddow Show, The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, Frontline, Fresh Air, All Things Considered, and many other programs. Her work has been featured prominently in documentaries such as Homegrown Hate, The War Among Us on ABC, and Documenting Hate, New American Nazis, which is a Frontline program. Erika is Regents Professor of History and Asian American Studies, a distinguished McKnight University professor, the Rudolph J. Vicoli Chair in Immigration History, and Director of the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota. Recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, she is also the president of the Organization of American Historians. The granddaughter of Chinese immigrants, Lee has testified before the U.S. Congress in its historic hearings on anti-Asian discrimination and violence. She's the author of 4 award-winning books, including The Making of Asian America and America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in America, which won the American Book Award and the Asian Pacific American Award for Literature, as well as many other honors. America for Americans is a tour de force and a necessary book for our times. Named to many best books lists, it was recently republished with a new epilogue on xenophobia and racism during the COVID-19 pandemic. Lee is a regular commentator in the media, including featured appearances in the PBS film series Asian Americans, the History Channel's America, the Promised Land, and PBS's The Chinese Exclusion Act. Professor Lee just this month received an honorary degree from Tufts University, where she was the 2022 commencement speaker. So I could go on at much more length about both Professor Belew and Professor Lee, but you want to hear from them, not from me. So let me close by just thanking both of them for their careful and insightful scholarship, as well as for their deep commitment to social justice and desire to help broad audiences understand the relevance of history for our times. Thank you both for joining us this evening for this Conversations at the Newberry program.
Thank you very much, Danny. And it's such an honor to be here with you, Erika. I'm so delighted to have this conversation with you. And hello, everybody on Zoom. I hear there are many of you. That's wonderful. And thank you to our in-person crowd, too, for kicking off your Memorial Day weekend with something a little bit difficult, but very important. So we thought we would begin by talking about our books within the corpus of books. And this is a question really more for Erika than it is for me. As you hear, she's a renowned historian of immigration to the United States, particularly Asian American immigration. And one part of that story has to do with journeys and hopefulness and the way people build new lives and create identities. The other part has to do with exclusion and xenophobia and how people are kept out and the work of keeping out and the logics of keeping out. So with that in mind, I was wondering if you would share with us what drew you to that darker side of the story now, and why the history of xenophobia is such an important part of what we might think of as history of the present, and understanding our moment that we confront.
Thank you for that wonderful question. Thank you to all of you for coming, to the Newberry for hosting us. I'm so excited about our conversation. You started out by saying this is a darker moment, a darker history, but as we're celebrating Memorial Day, is that better? Okay. As we're celebrating Memorial Day, I hope that one of the things we'll talk about are the ways in which white supremacy, hate, racism, xenophobia are entrenched in our history. I love this question because it actually helps me think about the evolution of my work as a scholar, and I think it reflects also perhaps a broader American understanding about immigration. And so when I think about this evolution, I remember distinctly being a college student, and I was always a history major, but being a college student and learning about some of these immigration restriction acts. In particular, for me, it was the Chinese Exclusion Act, first federal law that singled out an entire immigrant group for immigration exclusion, a law that directly impacted my family. However, even though I was a history major, even though fifth generation Chinese American, had never heard of this law. So my evolution was, what is this? It was one of coming from ignorance and absence of knowledge into I need to learn more. Over many years and several books, I began to understand and write about immigration and our history of xenophobia and racism. And I framed it as, we have a complicated relationship with immigration. And I always ended my books with, these are discriminatory laws. They had a real impact on people, on families, on generations, on communities. They did not end. We see the echoes in laws like Proposition 187 in California, which sought to ban undocumented immigrants from receiving public benefits such as public health and education, and more recently into the Muslim ban era. But then I always ended with a call to remember, to live up to our ideals of freedom, democracy, equality, and our welcome to immigrants. And that is why when 2016 came and I was teaching immigration history and the election happened, and then I went into my classroom mostly with first generation, not only immigrant, but refugee students, I really was at a loss to answer their questions about how this had happened. And I realized that not only the books on my shelves, but also my, I think now, more tepid or moderate framing of, it's complicated, a complicated relationship with immigration, that was not only sufficient, but perhaps contributed to our lack of preparedness or full understanding. And so that's when I delved into this long history of xenophobia and really tried to tackle and try to dismantle my own education and also the larger public framing about xenophobia being something that rises and falls with crises during economic strife, wartime, civil unrest. Historians in the past have almost written about the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment and violence as something that was almost natural, something inevitable. Unfortunate, yes, but kind of understandable. And I really took issue with that as almost an excusing xenophobia and racism, and wanted to dive more deeply into the roots of our fear of strangers, of anti-immigrant racism and violence as rooted in our histories of slavery, our histories of settler colonialism, how they have worked together, and how they have worked in concert with, rather than as an exception to, our nation of immigrants ideals. And so it was an incredibly depressing book to write day in and day out as I was following news of immigration bans, deportations, raids, etc. Published it in 2019, and then the pandemic happened. And as news of, first, outside of the United States, news of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism was being reported in places like Australia, the UK, Italy. I had this growing pit in my stomach related to the question of when is it going to come here, and what is that going to look like in the United States? And we now know the answer, and that is over 10,000 reported, which are still a fraction of the actual, but reported hate incidents directed at Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders since March of 2020, which continues to this day. So it's the evolution of my thinking. I don't think I will ever be able to go back to this. I hope I will. I'll correct myself. I hope I will be able to return to a point where in the epilogue I'll be able to rally the forces and end with a hopeful note. But I think it'll take some time to get back to that. So, but continuing on this conversation, of course, this recent 2 weeks has brought your research, the history of white supremacy, white nationalism, the ways in which it is deeply tied to our military culture, something that is not just recent, but has absolutely been part of our recent history after the Vietnam War. Can you share with us your evolution of this topic, how you first came to it, but also how it's evolved over the past few years since the book has come out, and how do you keep responding and helping all of us understand what's at stake today when we do read the newspaper and hear news of mass shootings in Buffalo, for example?
Thank you. So I was never a history major. I'm an accidental historian who fell into a history department and then got more and more capital H historian as time went on, and I will talk to you about that if you like later. But my training was in comparative history of ideas at the undergrad level, and then American studies as a graduate student. And what I really wanted to do was address something that I saw as strange as an undergraduate too, which is when you start reading about white supremacy as a system, not just in the US context, but worldwide, we're far from unique in our long history of racial violence and racial inequality and systems of oppression based on in and out categories of people. But we're very unique in how little we have done to publicly come to terms with that history and that shared story. So I was interested in why we had never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. At the time I started my dissertation back in 2005, we didn't have a National Museum for African American History yet. We didn't have the lynching memorial yet. We have these big legacies of horrific racial violence and inequality, and hardly anything by way of confronting them together. It's very unusual when we think about comparative examples. So I was drawn to this strange little upstart Truth and Reconciliation Commission in North Carolina, in Greensboro. And they had no government buy-in. They had no subpoena power. They had no criminal power. They had no capacity to punish anybody. All they were doing is convening people to tell the stories of what happened there back in 1979. And the story there was about a group of leftist demonstrators, many of you will know this story, who were fired upon by a united caravan of Klan and neo-Nazi gunmen. 5 people died, 1 African-American woman, and 4 people who presented as white. One of them was Cuban, but they presented as white. White men. And this event was one of these things where if you run across it when you're reading US history, it makes no sense. It's not in the right time period. It's not in the right place. It didn't fit with what I knew about Klan violence. The victims are all wrong. The way it was reported was all wrong. And then if you look at the trials, there are 2 criminal trials and 1 civil trial, and none of them come out the way they ought to, given the evidence of what happened. In short, it is an example of the interplay between systems of white supremacy and individually motivated racists, plain and simple, people who would tell you that they are. So as I was reading about this TRC, I got into the archives of the Klan and neo-Nazi activists who were involved in this shooting, and they said something that I could not stop thinking about. They said, well, I killed communists in Vietnam. Why wouldn't I kill communists in the United States? And that collapses things, right? That mixes up battlefield and home front. That mixes up wartime and peacetime. That flattens racial categories even, where everybody who shares this ideology is expendable and killable. And I thought it was very strange. And then it turns out that this movement has a huge paper archive that repeats this idea over and over and over again. And that's where Bring the War Home comes from. It's really about how, for these activists in what turned out to be, surprise, a coherent social movement that brought together Klansmen, neo-Nazis, skinheads, militiamen, and more, this idea of warfare at home was animating this string of racist attacks on targeted groups and then on the state. This is the movement that perpetrated the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which we hardly ever understand as the work of an organized movement, much less as domestic terrorism, even though it is the largest mass casualty event between Pearl Harbor and 9/11. It's also the movement that we are confronting today. This is the same movement that represented the organized and most violent component of the January 6th insurgency, and it's the movement that is laying siege to school boards all across the country. So this is an urgent threat. And it's not only an urgent threat in acts of what are often described as individual acts like the one in Buffalo. I would urge you never to use the phrase lone wolf for this because it is a deeply networked kind of violence. It's not just that, although this is the movement that gave us Buffalo and Charleston and the Tree of Life shooting and El Paso and Christchurch, we could go on. It's also a movement that is now doing something that was unthinkable to these activists in the 1980s, which is attempting an authoritarian political takeover of many parts of our democratic process and institutions. So it is an urgent threat. And so from that project came the Field Guide to White Supremacy, which is the binoculars you can see over there, which really arose out of the tail end of Bring the War Home. So Bring the War Home was in page proofs, which means, if you've not been through this incredibly arduous process, it means you're not supposed to do anything else to it. So Bring the War Home was in page proofs when the Unite the Right rally happened in Charlottesville in 2017. That's the one with the Nazis and the tiki torches, right? It was too late to add anything, and actually I'm glad I didn't, because that turned out to be really just the opening bell for a lot of bigger events that happened right afterward. But because of the timing, Bring the War Home has become an urgent act of public history. And the field guide is sort of a addendum that we created. My colleague Ramon Gutierrez and I put together to help journalists and others who are new to confronting sort of the broad system of problems that together make up white supremacy. So I can talk more about that if people are interested, but it's the sort of companion volume to help people get oriented. So I mean, it seems to me that we could easily go to a question we'd thought about asking each other about the role of history in thinking through these debates. And I'm interested to know from you, Erika, about how you see that playing out both in your higher education teaching and sort of history, capital H, that we're all involved in one way or another as we go about our lives and make our political decisions and consume our media.
You know, I was I was thinking about how the important anthology that the field guide is, but also the other two, one of which we're both involved in, Myth America, which I can't remember the subtitle. I think it's like Historians Take on the Biggest Lies and Myths in American History.
The frame is sort of all the things that people say about history on Twitter that are not true, and just trying to quickly set the record straight about some things.
But also the reporting. So I'm sure that we've all read multiple articles on Buffalo where that phrase lone wolf is repeated over and over again. And this is similar to this idea of exception, right? So yes, whatever has happened, the Muslim ban, the image of Border Patrol officers running down Haitian migrants, they're horrible, but they are exceptions. The lone wolf gunman is horrible what he did, but it's an exception. The rest of us, or the rest of the way in which we function as society is okay. We just have to get rid of or discipline or something with that exception. And historians, we study change over time. We study roots, R-O-O-T-S, and routes to the present. And it's not, I think, there have been generations of historians before us who have always been writing history of the present. But I do feel that perhaps what we're seeing today is a broader movement. Our graduate students are seeking out ways to do that before they finish their dissertations, before they get jobs. It's not just something that a senior scholar feels that they can do, but I think generations of people who are interested in history feel that they must do. So that it's not just, history is not just about explaining how we got here today, which is the way that I was taught. How did we get here today? How do we not repeat the lessons, right? This is the cliche. How do we not repeat the mistakes of the past, right? It's all very kind of using history as static, as a point of reflection, looking backwards. But I am really emphasizing with my students, and I just finished my semester, so now you're my classroom. But I've really been emphasizing with my students the idea that history not only teaches us how we got to where we are today, but what is at stake for tomorrow, which is slightly different than repeating the mistakes of the past. But it's like, I feel like it's more action oriented, that the stakes are really high. It's extremely urgent. And I think, certainly our writings are meant to engage with a broader audience, because I'm tired of repeating over and over again, giving the same basic history lessons. May is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I have the opportunity, the privilege, the honor to speak to many audiences about Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month issues. But I have to say that most of the time, I really am asked to give the same basic, informative lecture over and over again. And what that means is with a topic like Asian American history that is often invisible and not taught in high school, let alone college courses, that we have to do this basic education. And you can't get further. You can't get deeper into the issues. You can't move forward with the research as easily. And it's a cycle that is not conducive to critical learning, thinking, decision making, etc. So I think, that one of the ways in which the two of us, and there are many, many more of us doing this kind of work, one of the reasons behind, pushing history beyond the classroom into public spaces like this, with our writing, with our media coverage, with our speaking, is to try to, again, engage in larger conversations so that we don't have to keep on repeating the same basic things, but help to change the narrative, ask new questions, and advocate. It has been not always accepted in the academy to call oneself an advocate or to think of your scholarship as activist. But I think that the times have certainly called for that, to be sure. We are both on the committee for the Organization of American Historians 2023 National Conference. And the title, the theme of the conference that we chose was Confronting Crises, History for Uncertain Times. And so I'm going to pose that question back to you. You'd used the word crisis, in your description of your work. We know that we live in uncertain times. So what are you teaching your students, the next generation of historians, but also what are some of the challenges that you're facing in your public speaking, especially when when we are calling upon you to help make sense of tragedies in the hours, after they are happening, as we are still gathering facts. Yeah. So how does a historian step into that role?
So there's two parts to that. And first of all, we can't get away with letting her say like, oh, we're both on the committee and we decided. She's the president. She made the committee and the decision about what the thing is. So that's all. We are not at the same level here. But I did just do History of the Present with my students in America and World Civilization Part 3 a couple of hours ago at University of Chicago. And these are, I would put them up against any students anywhere. I love these students very, very much. And we talked about History of the Present because I'm absolutely 100% in agreement with you that it's not enough anymore to do where are we and how did we get here? Because even though that itself is under attack, under open attack, where are we and how did we get here? I really believe what Lisa Lowe wrote about this in Intimacies of Four Continents, that it's not just that history shows us where we were, it's that history shows us contingency. And this is the word that throws off the undergrads for a second, but it shows us that it's not predetermined, that the imaginary doesn't have the limits that we might think it does, just because we happen to be sitting here in this historical context. History is the tool that we can use to excavate all kinds of other possibilities. History is where we find hope. It's where we find different paths forward. It's where we find other things in the past that could have worked, that people gave up on for one reason or another, but that could have worked. And it's this locus of all kinds of possibility. And my thing about historians out in the public sphere is that when people are making arguments about history, and let's not get confused, Make America Great Again is an argument about history, right? It's making an argument about who is America? When was it great? Was it great? When was that? Can that happen again? That is a historical argument, and I want historians involved in that argument. I think that we're trained to think that through and to help others think that through with evidence and with a set of thinking skills that we can help teach people in our classrooms and outside of our classrooms. So I want part of that thing. That it's events like Buffalo or Pittsburgh or El Paso. I've written versions of the same op-ed so many times, and I've given the interview so many times, and it's really I don't want to make it about me, because my part in this is so tiny compared to grieving communities and compared to people who are facing down the threat of this every day. I find hope when we move the needle, and we are moving the needle. The FBI and DHS declaring white nationalists the greatest source of domestic terrorism. I never thought I would see that when I started writing this book. That's amazing. And of course now, because I'm a historian, I have to immediately say, like, policing is not going to do it. And if we are not very, very careful, that is going to have ripple effects directly into the communities that we're trying to protect. But it is movement. There are people listening. There are people listening every time we do this kind of conversation. There are people listening in our classrooms, and those people go out and talk to other people. And I think that the work of thinking and connecting and community building is the best thing we have, especially if we want to have a democracy and if we want to have institutions. That's a community project, so we have to be out there talking to each other. I wonder if we could go from there to sort of the guarding of American identity and definitions of America. I think
On the same wavelength.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Because to me, I always think of the broad story of US history as this radical promise, right? Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That is a radical promise. That is sort of an exceptional moment in its way, although with many caveats that we will shortly discuss. That promise was never meant for me. That promise was never meant for Erika. That promise wasn't meant for most of you in this room. That was for white, free, property-owning men who were in a particular time and place with particular resources and with claim to particular kinds of tools, right? And then somehow, over the course of time, that category has been expanded. I think the story of American history is about how people have come together and worked for inclusion in that category, worked to expand, worked to join hands and demand inclusion, worked to reach out hands and bring others in. But this is obviously not a decided interpretation or an ongoing promise that that's how it will be. So for me, that's a live wire in our politics. That's still a place where we really disagree. How do you think about that kind of guarding and gatekeeping and the work to expand or create solidarity or create inclusion on the other side?
Yes. So when I think about the ways in which American identity, what it means, so the title is, of our time here today is about belonging. What does it mean to be an American? I think about the ways in which, yes, certainly it's been from the ground up of people taking a stand, calling on the United States to live up its ideals. But it's also been a very defensive action on behalf of those who have claimed and have a stake in continuing to guard the borders around what has essentially been a very narrow and exclusive definition of American. So Kathleen already discussed the roots of that. We must remember the 1790, I know, it's the history lesson. You're not going to be quizzed right now, but we're going to throw out a couple of dates, though. The 1790 Naturalization Act, one of our most important and earliest federal laws, dictated in our new nation who had the right to become a naturalized citizen, free white male. So, of course, excluding, again, most of the peoples who were already present in the United States. I also, there are particular moments, inflection points in our history where these debates, where there has been an opportunity to go one way or another in terms of expanding the franchise, expanding that definition of American identity. And I think to the pre-Civil War era, the 1850s, and to a very specific location, and that is Massachusetts. When a small band of brothers established what was called the American Party, a new political party that was also more popularly known as the Know Nothings. They had very secret ceremonies, they had codes, they had oaths, and they were taught, had to swear actually to not share those with anybody. So they were supposed to say, "I know nothing." If someone asked, "What does the American Party do?" They were anti-Catholic. They were anti-immigrant. They were actually split on slavery, which led to their demise. But they believed that the Pope was directing mass migration of Europe's impoverished Catholics to the United States to take over the United States, to populate the West, the Western United States, and to wrest political power and control from true native, small n, born Americans. And so in their defense of the nation and in their anti-immigrant ideology, politics, and violence, they defined and helped to reaffirm a new definition of the American, meaning the native-born American. It had nothing to do with indigeneity, nothing to do with indigenous roots, but it had a lot to do with settler colonialism, because these individuals felt besieged from the ongoing threat of real Indians and the new threat of mass migration of peoples who they believed to be racially inferior and religiously dangerous. So we see this defensive guarding of American national identity happening during times of crises, but really becoming embedded. I mean, how many times I grew up calling myself a native-born American. I've stopped using that term because I now realize what the roots were. The roots of that term was to exclude, and also to exclude not only Irish Catholics, but American Indians from American identity. So we have movements time and time again. Their slogan, by the way, was "Americans must rule America." So it's identifying Americans. The must is about like this really defensive action, this urgency, this need to take up arms to defend the nation. Rule is about political power. And of course, slavery and the abolition movement is always lurking, underneath and also driving definitions of who is the real American. These are the long historical roots and routes to where we are today, as we continually, feel like we need to expand. We need to expand what it means to be an American, and it's a challenge. And I just want to impress upon the importance of understanding this long history of exclusion at the same time that there has been expansion, but that we can never take that inclusion for granted. I feel that when we're in a situation where the other side is well-funded, is well-organized in pushing for this narrow, racist, exclusive identity of what it means to be an American, I feel that we also need to organize and to combat that, to continue to insist on inclusivity whenever possible. What are you thinking about, because you study these individuals. My guys are in the past. I have to go to the Massachusetts Historical Society to read their minutes. You're seeing this develop, expand online. You're seeing the impact of their words translated into action. You're seeing the destruction right now And so what's your advice for all of us, but certainly the next generation, to combat this guarding, this violence, and you're going to have the last word. You need to send us off on a hopeful note, Kathleen. No pressure, but
I think the most important thing to me is connecting people who are impacted by this problem. If you go to Portland or Charlottesville or Charleston or other places that have had impacts, if you go to Buffalo, don't go now, but if you go in a while to Buffalo and El Paso and Pittsburgh, these places have a different relationship with this problem because they have been attacked. I don't want to be melodramatic or something, but that's all of us after January 6th. This was a direct attack on democratic process. It's not the same thing as an act of mass violence, but it's organized by the same movement, follows an ideology that we can understand. It has long historical roots. It has interconnected social nodes. It has mechanisms. All of these gunmen are sharing manifestos, not only to sort of give an ideological framing, but to share tactics, to share target selection information, to share weapon selection information. This is going to continue. It's meant to continue. It's meant to go viral. It's meant to spread. The hope, I think, is in understanding what that is and arranging appropriate interconnected response. A Pittsburgh community impacted at the Tree of Life shooting has way more resources and media access than Black Buffalo in the middle of a food desert. But they're both impacted by the same thing. Those are gunmen who share an ideology. So if we can organize around that, I think that's something really, really powerful. I think the other thing is to think carefully about when we confront problems that are transscalar, which is just historians speak for things that operate at multiple levels at the same time, right? You can read Belew Williams' fantastic work on this. But transscalar, meaning that white power is a problem because we don't tell the right stories in the newspaper, because we don't have the right laws on the book, because we don't have the right enforcement mechanisms, we don't have the right surveillance resources, we don't have the right history in our schools, we don't have the right mechanisms. So that means there's opportunities to respond at every one of those scales. Your local library could really use some help with how to prevent kids from getting radicalized in the free computers on the off hours. Your local school could really use some reasonable people to just go and sit at the school board meeting and make sure nothing crazy is happening. Your local journalists would really benefit from maybe a gentle nudge when you see lone wolf being thrown around in a way that's not responsible to this history. All of these things are things people can do. And if not that, just reading and learning about history, being at events like this, I mean, like, honestly, I really think this goes a long way. So I appreciate your willingness to do this with us. Do you want to reply also?
No, I think that we have a lot of questions.
We have a lot of great questions. So I apologize in advance to everyone here. We're not going to get to all of the questions. They've been pouring in the whole time you've been talking. So thank you that's a sign of such provocative and important ideas that you're sharing. So thank you to both of you for that. Thank you, Emily. I want to get to at least a couple rounds of questions. And again, you can text your questions to 833-899-3399. One listener asks, how do you account for the alignment between white supremacy ideas and Christian nationalism? Note the prevalence of Christian symbols, ideology, et cetera, at the January insurrection. I don't know if, Kathleen, you want to address that, and Erika, if you want to say something about a longer history of that as well.
Sure. Okay, so January 6th represents the collision of three different groups of people. One is QAnon, which is relatively small and also very new. It goes very fast, very deep, and although it's activating some very old conspiracy theories, I don't think we understand it very well yet, and that's a historian answer. Sociologists can tell you a different response. The second group, which is the largest, is sort of the Trump base Make America Great Again folks. And within that large group, there's a spectrum of radicalization, from people who are just there to participate in events to people who were hoping to cause some destruction that day. The third group is the militant right, and that includes the white power movement, people in militias, and by militias, I'm talking about illegal private armies that are not regulated. I'm not talking about National Guard units anytime today when I say the word militia. Those activists are much more organized, those are the ones that you saw armed in tactical gear, making their way through the crowd, organizing the breach of the building. And we saw that unfold in the footage. It's also what has emerged from the investigations so far, is that the white power and militant right cadre of people was communicating with each other. They were interested in bringing in weapons if they could. It goes on and on like this. It's what we would expect. Christian nationalism within that ideology is one sort of subsection. So what we have to understand about the white power movement, and this really starts in the late 1960s, is that these activists saw themselves as under assault from the various changing factors about American life. They perceived such a state of emergency that they were willing to be very, very open about who they let into the tent. If you think about a Christian identity, conservative housewife being in the same movement with an urban, hard-drinking, tattooed skinhead, you can see that this is a big tent of people. So Christian nationalism has people in the tent, but it would be not all of, so they are drawing in the 1980s from the same wave that is fueling evangelical surges in evangelical congregations and increasing politicization of those groups. But if we were to draw a Venn diagram, it's two overlapping circles. It's not the same thing. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks. Erika?
And there's, of course, a long history of connecting whiteness with Protestantism in particular. You know, I've already talked about how native-born Americans identified American identity in the mid-19th century in opposition to Catholics. Of course, the same goes for defining Americanism in opposition to Jewish immigrants, to heathens of all kinds. So it's race as well as Protestant Christianity. In the more recent decades, Catholicism and American Catholicism has not been as much of a factor in of exclusion or discrimination as it had in the past. But we can only look to things like the resurgence of anti-Semitism, things like the Muslim ban, and the conflation of, say, communism with heathenism as modes of exclusion in our contemporary era that have very, very long roots in our history.
Thank you. So another question came in that I think wants us to move a little beyond the U.S. borders also. It says earlier in your talk you mentioned that similar topics on racism, immigration, et cetera, have been handled differently in other countries. I think, Kathleen, you mentioned Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. This listener asks, how do other former imperialist countries handle topics like this? Are there any hints that the U.S. can take, or are the situations just too different as we look at a history of xenophobia and white supremacy?
When I do comparative and transnational work, it's really important to again look at the different scales and levels and the ways in which they intersect, even before you get to then a global comparison or analysis. So there are unique local and regional and national contexts and factors that help to drive why something, why the anti-Chinese movement erupts in San Francisco, why the anti-Catholic movement erupts in Boston but then spreads across the mid-Atlantic states. So it's not so easy to do that work, But one of the things that I have found, not only recently with the spread of social media or with global news, but going back to the early 20th century, is the ways in which ideas about race, xenophobia, discrimination, and specifically because I study immigration restriction, how it has always traveled. So in the early 20th century, when American lawmakers and labor leaders and Americans in general were talking about the Yellow Peril or the Oriental Invasion, we see people, those activists, migrating to Canada, migrating to South America, to Mexico. These ideas being spread by print, but also by bodies. And then we also see a series of copycat legislation, especially around Asian exclusion, including in countries that literally have maybe single-digit numbers of Asian immigrants coming to their borders at the time. More recently, the spread of cable news and especially social media has created an echo chamber. And we see this especially in relationship to Islamophobia, where we can be reading about laws being passed in France, it's being retweeted in the United States. The network, what the Council of American Islamic Relations calls the Islamophobia Network, well-funded, organized, global, is then again, retweeting and reverberating their conferences, there's networks. It has only grown and expanded in recent times.
Do you want to address that, or should we move to another?
I would just add that I think a lot of these mechanisms are foreshadowed, if not pioneered, by extremist and fringe movements who were interested in figuring out how to circumvent laws prohibiting the movement of hate literature across borders, and therefore had this huge incentive to adapt to the early internet. So the white power movement is using computer-to-computer network message boards in 1983, 84, and spreading all kinds of things, but doing effectively social network activism way back then, way before we heard about Facebook. They were talking about personal ads and recipe exchanges alongside assassination lists and ideological writing. So we have to think about the opportunism of hate movements as sort of a site of early adaptation and pioneering, creation of issues, and not just sort of as responsive to whatever is happening in the mainstream.
So there's a lot of questions that are looking for some hope. Which maybe shouldn't surprise us, and maybe you can help us with that, at least in a couple rounds. So one says, you appear to be telling us that we've actually never been the country of the myth of America, right? The myth of inclusion, the myth of a nation of immigrants. What should make us believe that we can become that country?
That's a hard one. To be sure, and I draw a lot on my own family's history, and this is where that story of, again, I'm going to use that overused, phrase, complicated, the complicated nature of immigration, but also I think it's also about resilience. So I know that my grandparents came from China in order to seek out that promise of a better life, if not for themselves, then for their children and for their grandchildren. And to be clear, I think many of those dreams came true for that generation and my generation. I just gave the commencement speech at my alma mater. And I thought about my grandfather, who came as, and I'm sure we have so many of these stories in our own family histories, but he came not being able to speak English. As a 13-year-old, he was put in a first grade classroom. He didn't know how to communicate that he needed to use the bathroom, so he poured ink on his hands, showed that it was dirty so that the teacher would excuse him so that he would go he could use the bathroom. He had always wanted to be a scholar, but he would never have been able to be accepted. He couldn't go to college. He worked in a restaurant for his entire life. He would have never been able to get a PhD to get a PhD, to become a historian of American history, to be the president of our professional organization. And so when before I gave this commencement speech, I thought about him, and I thought about, I think he would be proud. None of us would have imagined something like that, but I think that they might have thought, this is why we came to the United States. So there are so many of these stories in our own personal family and community histories. But it wasn't without cost. It wasn't without sacrifice. And I think what's challenging is that we see the same pattern of exclusion and resilience for today's immigrant generation. And so in 2016 and 2017, when we're hearing a serious presidential candidate talking about a complete and total shutdown of Muslims to the United States, really, as someone who studies the Exclusion Act, whose family has been targeted, I really could not believe. I had never thought that we would be back in this position again. And of course, we elected him, and then the Muslim ban went into effect. So the hope comes out of seeing what then happened. What then happened over the entire Trump administration, especially around immigrant rights. I would go to the Stop the Muslim Ban rallies, and then I would go to the Stop Children in Cages rallies, the family separation rallies, and I began to see a larger network of people, especially young people, at those rallies, no longer splintered, but united, seeing that it was the same forces that have always tried to divide us, and seeing common cause and understanding that there's a greater enemy than the community across the street that we've been taught to kind of look at with suspicion. I do feel that especially the students that we teach, I mean, they know what's at stake with climate change, with police violence, with racism and supremacy. And I have great hope. I have the privilege of teaching them every semester, and I have great hope in this next generation. So I think look to the young, but don't leave it only up to them. We have to support them. We have to guide them, because they're facing, I think, even greater challenges than we have in some time.
So can we do one more in just kind of a lightning round? First of all, I should say there's just a lot of appreciation for both of you on here for the relevant conversation and for the work that you do as teachers and as historians. And maybe that's a connection to this last question, because I think that's something you're both doing, right, to try to make change. But this questioner is asking, what are the types of things that individual people can do to be able to prevent these kinds of things from happening, racism, hate crimes, et cetera? What do you tell your students to do beyond the classroom, or what might you help our audience today understand? I think to move sort of from a feeling of powerlessness to a feeling of hope and action. In a minute or two.
I'm not sure I can move us to a feeling of hope this week, honestly. It's, with Buffalo and Uvalde, it's soon. I think that it is okay to have the moment of hopelessness and grieving. I think that's part of what we have to do. And then I think we have to get up and do the next thing, right? We have to do this, and then we have to get up and do the next piece of the work. And if everyone can do the next piece of the work, that would mean something.
I think that's just a wonderful way to end. I do think you had earlier you shared very concrete things for us to do. We don't all get to be invited to the Newberry to have this wonderful conversation, but we all have a local public library. We all can volunteer in big and small ways. I think sometimes it's overwhelming to think about the number of challenges. and to think about, am I a protester? Am I, can I help with the deportation case? Do I have those skills? What are my skills? What are my skills? And so I think it's important to think about our own skills, our networks, our interests, even if it's just gritting your teeth and having that really uncomfortable conversation over Thanksgiving or Memorial Day picnic or July 4th or whatever it is. Big and small things, and consistently doing them.
Well, thank you both for all the big things that you do to help us understand. And please join me in thanking Professor Lee and Professor Belew. We're so glad that you could join us at the Newberry tonight. And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. If you missed part of the program or you want to share it with friends, a recording of the program will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel within a few days. And Newberry programs remain free and open to the public, thanks to the generosity of our donors. So during this critical time, we need the support of our entire community. Please support the Newberry by making a gift today to make free programs like this possible. You can do that by going to newberry.org/give. And please join us for our upcoming programs. On Thursday, June 16th at 2 p.m., we're going to have a movable reading of James Joyce's Ulysses. And on Tuesday, June 21st at noon, please join us for Make Music Chicago, featuring Mississippi Heat and John Primer and the Real Blues Band, which will be across the street in Washington Square Park. You can register for these and other programs on our website, newberry.org, and you can also join our mailing list there to find out about more activities at the Newberry. Again, thank you for joining us this evening here at the Newberry and online, and thank you so much, Erika, Lee, and Kathleen Belew.